This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
Hello and welcome to another of our Rural Delivery online interviews. Today I'm catching up once more with Matt Costello, Animal Protein Analyst for Rabobank Food and Agribusiness Research and Advisory. How are you, Matt?
G'day, Roger. Great to chat.
Yeah, you too. Look, we last spoke in April. The Q1 report had just been released. You've just got a new report out. The title, New Zealand Sheep Meat, Maximising the Cut. We'll get into that in a minute. Why the deep dive now into lamb?
Yeah, well, I think last time we caught up, Roger, was talking beef and the optimism around the beef market. This year, looking at a sheep meat report, and I suppose the real reason why I looked into it, particularly if you look at what's transpired this season. At the start of the year, I think most people, companies, farmers, industry would have been hoping for a year like we had in 2014. Lamb prices around the $100 a head mark again, and certainly that was my expectations at the start of the year. And then what's transpired, a lot of discussions with our clients internally within the bank around why we saw prices, I suppose, ease throughout the most of the year, really, to where that $90 head mark or thereabouts. So the reason why usually price adjustments in New Zealand take the shape of supply variables, at least in the short term, that dictates prices. But I think what transpired throughout the year and what became more and more evident was that the story in 2015 has really been, largely driven by very much weaker demand from most of our key export markets.
Now, how's that happened? What's gone on to make that change? Because it's quite significant.
Yeah, it has been, and the report, I suppose, taking a step back, instead of just explaining to our farming clients around the prices received are a little bit lower on a per kilo or a per head basis, was to take a bit of a deeper dive around the fundamentals at play. And if you can appreciate a lamb or a sheep, the animal is broken into many different parts, and those parts yield different percentages, they return different percentages, and ultimately the end market demand, I suppose, dictates what prices do. So the report was, important to acknowledge that the report was written in conjunction with the Red Meat Profit Partnership. So some of the data I looked at utilising was contributed by some of the meat processing companies, which was fantastic. So, as we looked through the animal and broke down the different segments of it, it was pretty clear to look at a couple of areas as to why the prices had changed, and most notably the forequarter part of the carcass, which is ultimately destined for the Chinese market, mainly Middle East a little bit, but mainly the Chinese market. So the Chinese market, we've seen a real slowdown in that market, and I suppose also we've seen a little bit weaker demand out of the UK market.
It's important to note that I'm looking at a diagram here that spells out very clearly the parts of the animal and the role they play in returns to farmers. I'd encourage people to have a look at the report and see that. Can you just talk us through that diagram?
Look, these are just estimates, and you can appreciate that, our clients will get to see the report, and I've broken down into sort of four main portions, including the co-products as well. But, the idea of what I'm trying to explain here and highlight is that, you've got different parts of the animal returning different percentages. So on one hand, you've got the forequarter, which, the meat yields about 28%, but it returns about 24%. If you then look at our higher valued loin, rack style cuts, the middle part of the animal or the middle part of the carcass, it yields only about 16%, but it actually returns about 24%. So, it's important to acknowledge, and the challenge that we have as an industry, we're not just producing a standard homogeneous product that is just moved on. There's lots of parts to the animal that needs to find a home, and I suppose highlighting this year, if you get a weakness in one portion of the animal or one portion of the carcass, it can have either a negative or a positive impact on the prices our farmers and our exporters receive. And in this year, it has been weaker demand for certain cuts, which has led to weaker prices.
If we could just dig a little bit into that weaker demand. Now, that's been particularly prevalent in China. Largely based, as I understand it from your report, on record Chinese domestic production. Is that? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, exactly, Roger. It has been. The Chinese market has been an interesting one. It burst on the scene in 2013. 2014, it took about 40% of our total sheep meat supply. So it's been a phenomenal growth story, and it's probably been a few reasons why we saw fantastic growth into that market. If you look at Chinese sheep meat production, it remained relatively flat between 2007, 2013, and with that production and growing demand in China, we saw record prices in China retail prices go to record levels in China throughout that period. So what has happened in the last couple of years? New Zealand, we've had record exports, as I said, just continual growth into that marketplace. Australia has also seen large volumes export into China, but then the Chinese domestic market has increased production significantly. So if you look at just 2014 compared to 2013, they increased production by an additional 200,000 tonnes of sheep meat. Bearing in mind, roughly speaking, New Zealand produces about 500,000 tonnes. So we are talking about the world's largest sheep meat producing country. They produce about 8 times what New Zealand does, around the 4 million tonnes mark. So phenomenally large market, and what we've essentially seen in a very, summarised way has been an oversupply into that Chinese market.
Has it been an oversupply? I guess there's various places in the market, just as there's various cuts across the animal. We tend to operate at the higher end. We need to operate at the higher end. When we spoke about beef, about 3 months ago, we were talking about whether or not we'd actually reached the edge of elasticity in terms of growing prices for beef. Could we be in the same position for lamb, that there is a point where consumers will actually, maybe go to other proteins or reduce their consumption overall?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Roger, and I think what we've seen particularly, I think we've got to talk about two different markets. If you look at the Chinese market, their demand is typically for lower valued cuts, some of the breast sort of products, some of the shoulder products and the forequarter, so lower value cuts. And we can't underestimate the importance of that, because a lot of the products, and particularly when you put in things like offals, they have certainly lifted the floor price, but just this year they're paying a little bit less for it given the weaker demand for it. But I think if you look at more the elasticity of demand and lamb as a higher valued protein source, what we have seen is also the top end of the market. So that is your European markets. They're paying less for our top quality cuts. So while we've had an increase in prices or demand for the lower value cuts, particularly from the Chinese market, we have seen a bit of a weaker demand or the willingness to pay at the higher end hasn't been as strong as what we've seen, particularly, I suppose, pre-GFC. It's an interesting balance because, I think there's the demand for the product from Chinese is, as I said, the lower value cut. So I don't think it's run its course in terms of the consumer walking away from the product. It's more just, I think there's just literally been a short to medium term oversupply in the market, and I think that's sort of led to a bit of a correction in prices. Just looking at the EU briefly, it's a market that's losing its share of our exports, but it's still a very vital market for us, which we've got to get right. Exactly, and the EU, I've got a sort of a table in there or a figure in there just looking at our quota fulfillment, and I think it's been pretty well known that that's been declining over time. If you look back in 2010, I think we fulfilled about 86% of that quota. In 2014, it's sort of down around 65, 70% fulfillment. So it has been, there has been weaker demand from it. More specifically, this year, what we've seen is a bit of a slowdown from the UK market, more specifically, given they've had high slaughter rates out of the UK market, and there's also been the British pound versus the euro. The euro has weakened considerably. So the UK or the European markets, they export and they sort of trade amongst themselves a lot. So when you've got a currency working, against the British or the UK segment of the EU, it sort of has meant that there's been more legs, lamb legs kept in the British market, which again, the UK is our second largest market and one of our most important EU markets. So there has been a little bit of an oversupply into the EU, more specifically the UK market, which has also led to a bit of a weakening in prices for those leg cuts. I know you're painting this as being more of a demand-side issue, but the focus in New Zealand is, of course, often on the supply end, and we need to be very cognizant that there is still improvement to be had there. You make some recommendations in the report for both producers, processors, and I guess the industry bodies and the government. Would you just be able to take us very quickly through what you think those are and the effect that you think that they can have? Yeah, I wanted, I suppose, to have a few thoughts around, why we look globally and we understand very, very clearly that New Zealand, given we have a very small domestic market, we have to look exports. And unfortunately, for a lot of what happens and what dictates our prices, a lot of these things are out of our control. But importantly, I think for each part of the supply chain, there are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained. So I looked at a couple of key points, and I think from a producer's perspective, and I think also from the processor's perspective, we always need to keep in mind that we're producing a product that the end customer demands. So every time we're producing or exporting or marketing, we have to keep thinking about that end user who's ultimately paying, some strong prices for our product. Otherwise, that's when you start to see the substitution towards the cheaper protein. So, a few of the points I just talked about from a producer's perspective, it's important to supply stock to your processors that hit the required market specification, supplying stock consistently and on time. And an important one for me, I think, is developing these long-term processor relationships, because I think with developing these relationships from farm gate to processor, and then ultimately the same can be said from processor to the end user, whichever segment of the supply chain our product ends in, is critical. So that's a massive one for me, and I understand and I can appreciate that. Given the competition for stock and the procurement of stock, it does enable farmers to play the spot market, to look for the benefits there. But I think for the long-term good of the industry, we need to start to enter into more long-term supply chain arrangements and agreements.
Okay, look, now I'm probably going to have to leave it there. I'll encourage people to pick up a copy of the report, but just before I go, can you give us a quick comparison, Australian sheep meat producers versus New Zealand? It's always useful to look across the Tasman and sort of see what the differences are.
Yeah, I suppose the main point I can make there, Roger, just quickly, is that the Australian lamb sheep meat industry this year has fared pretty well, and roughly talking about 45% of Australia's lamb production stays domestic. So you've got a huge safety blanket that absorbs a lot of product, and that's certainly been felt this year, knowing that the export demand that the weaker export demand that New Zealand's faced this season, Australia's going through the same scenario, if you like. But then if you look at why prices haven't declined, they have this large domestic market, which, if you think about a domestic market, you don't have to worry about trade restrictions, you don't have to worry about currency, market access, shipping, etc. So all those things have helped support the Australian industry, and again, highlighting that New Zealand continually needs to look for new markets and new promotional marketing activities to develop strong awareness and strong demand for our world-class product.
What's the number for New Zealand domestic production consumption as a percentage?
It's less than 10%.
All right, Matt. Look, thanks very much for your time today. We always appreciate it, and I'll encourage people to pick up a copy of your report.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Roger.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.